seem to...
My presentation today is indeed titled The Missing 18th Sustainable Development Goal, and that missing development goal can be called communication for all. And of course, as we are discussing COVID-19 and the pandemic and everything related to it, we can also ask ourselves, so what's so important about that missing development goal? I think it's even more important now than 10, 15 years ago when the discussion about the Millennium Development Goals started, although even in those days there were people, including myself, who raised the issue of communication goal for the Millennium Declaration. We thought it important and necessary to have a specific focus on communication in order to multiply, in order to distribute these goals more widely with all the communication means and tools available to us. But although it was 2003 or 4, if I'm not mistaken, that these discussions started, and now we are 15, 16 years later, and these goals are still without the proper reference to what we call the 18th Sustainable Development Goal, communication for all. And as I already mentioned, that's becoming more and more important in the age of COVID-19 and everything which has the pandemic caused as a result. So I would like to structure my presentation in a number of ways. I would like to give a bit of background and history to the current discussion. So I start briefly with a reference to the Millennium Development Goals. As all of you know, they were inaugurated in 2000 at the change of the millennium. And then the transition to the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, which we're currently experiencing and working in. And they will last until 2013. And then the question is, what will come next? I'm currently co-editing a book for Palgrave on the Sustainable Development Goals and the future of the Sustainable Development Goals. And our question indeed is what will come next? Because it's obvious from today that we will not be able to meet all the major goals agreed upon in 2015. We will still have a lot of work left for us when we approach 2013, I'm afraid. Okay, so I try to give a bit of a transition from the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, to the SDGs, then also highlight once again the need for that 18th SDG. This was the opening title. I've also mentioned the presentation outline, that's number 2. So, and then that's the second one, yes. So that's what I aim to achieve during my presentation. And then we move to the first group of sheets. That's the Millennium Development Goals. So as you may recall, in 2000, when those Millennium Development Goals were agreed and discussed, a lot of countries and a lot of people were excited about it, and I must say I was one of them, but gradually we figured out that they didn't cover all the problems we were, so to speak, facing in the development community. And so in a nutshell, we thought that they were too bureaucratic to be capable of addressing all the problems from, let's say, a grassroots or a participatory perspective. So they were mainly looking at development as an engineering problem. Technologists, architects, and engineers who could solve problems for us, and that's a typical modernization approach. Governments doing things on behalf of people and assuming that people don't have a voice to be reckoned with. So development seen as an engineering problem to be solved from a top-down perspective, and of course it also leads to very reductionist views on development, very causal perspectives. One is the outcome of the other, one follows, etc. Well, by now we know that development is a very complex and multifaceted problem, and so some variables may not be available in the initial discussions, but will determine or maybe overtake the bulk of the discussion at a later stage. And what is normally being discussed are quantitative criteria rather than qualitative criteria. So many values in development are not quantifiable. They need to be addressed from a more qualitative perspective. Values like freedom, tolerance, equality, it's very difficult to pin them down to data and figures. So they were obviously also missing in the discussion on the Millennium Development Goals, and especially in a combined fashion like human and indigenous rights, communication and culture. They were not properly addressed at that stage. So they were bureaucratic and ambitious, but they were up to a point also quite narrow and quantitative in their approach to the issues of development goals. But nevertheless, these Millennium Development Goals, they have done something good. They have achieved quite a number of things, and here is in small print, so maybe not easy to read in the background, but basically the successes of the Millennium Development Goals can be summarized under a number of concepts, but mainly related to schooling and health-related issues. Primary education has improved, the issue of health and sanitation, and up to a point women's health have improved. Up to a point also more longer term and general kind of aims like the participation of women in political processes and activities. All these things can be considered to be successes, but up to a point they were only reaching certain objectives and not the final destination many of the people involved in the discussion had hoped for. So they went for a more ambitious scheme, but also a more realistic scheme, in the sense that they wanted to bring them all together under more realistic option. And so by certain standards, people have argued that it was the Sustainable Development Goals were a major reboot, while others have argued it's just another acronym for more or less the same. Now, let's start with a major reboot concept and the ambitious concept, which is also written down in what they call the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, is a plan of action for people, planet and prosperity. It also seeks to strengthen universal peace in larger freedom. We recognize that eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions, including extreme poverty, is the greatest global challenge and an indispensable requirement for sustainable development. So very ambitious, very forward-looking. One also can see that manifested in the way these new set of goals have been formatted. Instead of 8 Millennium Development Goals, we have now 17. And you can look at it briefly: end poverty, end hunger, well-being, quality education, gender equality, water and sanitation. So they have been narrowed down to, obviously, or at first sight, more realistic objectives. And if you go into more detail, you will say, yes, one goal is more realistic than another goal, and one goal is more achievable than the second or the third one. Nevertheless, one needs certain kind of elements to evaluate these goals. And one normally agrees that one needs at least 3 criteria to make a proper evaluation or validation of a goal. First is a numerical outcome, a percentage or a number, so to speak, a specific deadline, by when, by what date a goal needs to be made, or met, and thirdly, a well-defined domain. So one has to define what kind of goal one wants to aim for. And looking at from these three criteria, one again has to say these 17 goals are not all achievable set by these three criteria. Some targets can be set and can be achieved. They are verifiable, but others are not. And it is fair to say that the goals which are more realistic are the ones which are more aimed at goals set for so-called developing countries, not so much the developed countries, because they have been from the very beginning welcoming a new discussion, welcoming the evaluation of the Millennium Development Goals, but they were very reluctant to become self-critical and put themselves into the picture. And that is easy to identify if you see that targets like overweight or obesity and breastfeeding are not fully developed in the Sustainable Development Goals, while especially the one on obesity is definitely a valid one also for the developed countries. So there was a reluctance at the side of the developed countries to come up with very specific, quantifiable and time-bound targets. So the critics of all of this, they therefore argue there is not much difference and dissimilarity between the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. And in a way, those which are achievable were already achievable under the Millennium Development Goals. Although, once again, the number of goals have broadened from 8 to 17, and the number of targets have also increased substantially. But again, at that level, the targets, there are officially 169 ones, and so those critics, they say, in order to do it well, in order to come up with a proper program, another platform, another set of Sustainable Development Goals, we need to go beyond the traditional ways of looking at this. We need to include civil society, think tanks, academics, but more in particular the people at large or the citizens in countries, to hear their voice and to ask them what is important and how to achieve these goals. And that's obviously, apart from a couple of specific cases, not the way these Sustainable Development Goals have been set up and are being worked out. A major question in that regard is how can global targets make a difference at national and subnational levels? That's a question, of course, which comes with any kind of discussion on multilateralism and universal validities and international collaboration, but it is once again also a problem here at this very ambitious objective of Sustainable Development Goals. So that's, so to speak, the context in which we can look at this discussion. And then let me go to the next sheet and highlight the one which is missing, namely the communication for all, the 18th, or what we call the 18th Sustainable Development Goal. Okay, and as I said, the discussion started already in the early 2000s, but the major push has been given around 2010, and some people who are worth naming are two representatives of the WACC, the World Association for Christian Communication, Lee and Vargas, and they have also produced an interesting book, which is available for those of you interested in reading it. They made the well-documented and well specific and detailed argument that unless we include an 18th Sustainable Development Goal, namely communication for all, we cannot really aim for a proper achievement of the 17 others development goals. So we should, at maybe this late stage of the game, but we should incorporate it in all the discussions going on and continuing from now onwards. They defined the Sustainable Development Goal 18, communication for all, with the goal to expand and strengthen public civic spaces through equitable and affordable access to communication technologies and platforms, media pluralism and media diversity. And I once again direct you to the book, their book, to look for more details. One organization which has picked up that discussion was a group in Montreal in Canada, and they in June or July of this year came up with a statement on communication for all. What does it mean for us living in the digital age? And they have therefore agreed to what they call a Montreal Statement on Sustainability in the Digital Age. Here they clearly identify what is needed for the future. We need to build a new social contract for the digital age, which addresses individual rights, justice and equity, inclusive access and environmental sustainability. Ensure open and transparent access to data and knowledge, foster public and private collaborations, promotes research and innovation, and support targeted communication, engagement, and education. So it's a holistic approach to what is needed for the future of us as a society. And I just making a comment. I would have liked them replacing the references to access with the reference to participation, because in my opinion and in my work, access is just the first step on the road to full participation, so to speak. So access is, of course, the entry gate to full participation, but it is not the end destination for a sustainable communication for all strategy. So in my own work, and that is available in articles and books, I've highlighted a couple of challenges which are still there in our discussion on sustainable development goals. Firstly, how can we bring together the right stakeholders at the right time in the right place? I'm not saying that's only a coalition of people's communities, people's organizations, or the right stakeholders. We need to be realistic and incorporate also private enterprise and major corporations, but we need to incorporate a representative sample of all these stakeholders, and that's still up for discussion, especially at international levels. Second, how do we make difficult trade-offs, meaning not only trade-offs in the economic sense, but one cannot achieve all of these goals at once at the same time. So we need to be strategic and negotiate the phasing in and phasing out of some of these, and that's often a difficult task for all groups committed to such kind of exercise. Thirdly, how do we build in accountability and transparency for action? So all this should take place in an open environment, in a public space, so that people can participate freely and know what they are talking about, so that no decisions have to be made in small circles behind closed doors, etc. Fourthly, how to organize this in a participatory and democratic way. That's probably saying the same as the first and the third challenge, but it at least highlights and emphasizes once again that we pay and we advocate for a participatory and democratic process rather than a process which tends to be too often a top-down approach at international and governmental levels. And then fifthly, as the 18th Sustainable Development Goal is not yet fully in place, we definitely need to give it its proper place and function, and therefore also an additional challenge in all of this. Now, in our deliberations, we've also taken in the discussion on COVID-19, and by way of summary or by way of conclusion or introduction of a possible discussion, we have presented, or we are presenting, a so-called communication framework to tackle pandemics. And we had, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic in mind while discussing and drafting this. We've done this in a phased way by, in total, 11 steps, if I'm not mistaken. We have 11 steps. So I'm going quite fast through these different steps, and you can look them up for yourself afterwards if you want to. But we need to start at a certain level, and in order to go for the multidimensionality and the complexity of such a framework, we've opted for a national approach. So we should start at the National Communication Task Force, but that may well be in an Indian context a more state-based approach or a provincial approach or a regional approach in certain other contexts. But I think it's important, and that's what we are advocating for, that there is a coherent a grouping of representatives and people involved in such a task force. It shouldn't be the exclusive domain of specialists and government officials and bureaucrats, so to speak. What does the task force have to do? That's step 2. They have to identify the target audiences, the language and the communication channels. And in multilingual countries, and India is an example, but many other countries are also multilingual or using different languages to communicate through different channels, etc. So it is more complex than sticking to one language we are currently using, like English, but we should be aware that every language comes with its own culture and elements related to that, which may sound a bit strange as a step 3, but given what we've experienced over the past couple of years, I'm not only referring to the United States for a president who has been accused of putting up more lies than truths in his public performances. But the issue of misinformation, fake news, and a mixture of all of that, the latest catchy word, and that's why I made a reference to my background in today's presentation, is deep fakes. So the argument is that with artificial intelligence, we can put up a show and pretend to be somewhere where we don't happen to be, and we can, or I can be given words that I don't utter, but a smart videographer can manipulate it in such a way that it sounds all natural. So all these things to be addressed as misinformation and fake issues, they have contaminated the objectives set for such a group of people who are genuinely interested in a framework to tackle pandemics, because they have to handle also all the hacks and all the attempts by hackers and lobbyists to manipulate the data and to present a picture which is not helpful or useful for the proper identification of issues and the proper tackling of the pandemic. That's step 3. Step 4, which goes in a combined fashion, is who will be the representatives, who will be the people to transmit the message, transmit the information. In the past, we have been exposed to concepts like opinion leaders, etc. Nowadays, one talks about champions, social influencers. But we should not limit it to individuals. We should also look for community representatives and sometimes representatives of certain community aspects, like faith community, etc., to assist us and to help us with such an exercise. But what is very important, and that is step 5. Okay, now develop a unifying rather than fragmented message at national and local levels. Yes, so referring to the step 4 with the influencers and the opinion leaders or the celebrities, we need to make sure that the message we are trying to bring is unifying, a coherent message, not a fragmented one. And that unfortunately has been the case too often during this current COVID-19 pandemic. I spent some time in Europe and was exposed to all the nonsense about not to wear, or the disadvantage of wearing mouth masks, etc., mouth masks. And then afterwards, even the experts had to revisit their initial advice and urge people to wear them, etc. So that's not a way to transmit messages, unless you want to confuse people and not transmit the proper message. That also means that we have to include step 6 in such an exercise. We should base our message development, the drafting of the messages, based on science and truth-based considerations, rather than on beliefs and in certain cases religious observations only. So scientific validity does play a major role in such a campaign strategy, and therefore it should be taken on board in the phasing in of such a communication frame. You also need to have a support group which is not only the front of such a campaign, but you also need that coalition to sponsor it, to support it, to carry it, so to speak, to make it sustainable. And that coalition can come from different sources and backgrounds. Therefore, we make the reference to a coalition of philanthropists, academics, and media professionals, but you can also broaden it with people from the private community and governmental communities, etc. So what is needed is a large group of people. Part of them have the knowledge and the expertise, part of them have the financial and other kind of resources to make it viable and make it sustainable. 10 and 11 are the ways to evaluate, to monitor and to reorganize or to organize the the next phase of such a communication framework. So what we try to advocate for is an ongoing exercise and an ongoing process, which has, of course, a start and a finish, but which is also circular in the attempts to make it more achievable and more complicated and sophisticated each time the process starts and evolves. I quote one of the drafters. Many of you may not know this person. He happens to be a country man of me. He's also Belgian, Jan van der Moortel. He worked for UNDP and the Millennium Development Goals. He was one of the drafters of the Millennium Development Goals. He, in his assessment, says the Sustainable Development Goals offer a better framework than the Millennium Development Goals, but considerably more work is required to turn their potential into a practical reality. So it's still work in progress. And being or talking for a mainly Indian audience, I want to remind us that one of the great philosophers, economists, and thinkers is one of your countrymen, Amartya Sen, and he, in his famous quote, says, "The deciding issue has to be one of democracy. An overarching value must be the need for participatory decision-making on the kind of society people want to live in, based on open discussion with adequate opportunity for the expression of minority positions." Okay, thank you very much for your interest. If you are interested in more, there are 2 more sheets, one with 2 books which I advertise, Sustainable Development Goals in the Asian Context, and the other one is a handbook of communication for development and social change, which are both on the market. Thank you very much.